Alright, Shove It Squad, welcome back to the show which helps you know. One of my favourite wrestling what-ifs was, what if WCW didn't get taken over by the WWE? Was it actually capable of surviving with the way that the company was? Now, obviously the TV network didn't want WCW anymore, so they were pretty much screwed. But there's this strange period of time in 2001 where just for a few months, it looked like WCW was improving. It's an interesting time in WCW because Russo and Bischoff are both out. So for the final few months, we're relying on Johnny Ace, Ed Ferrara and Terry Taylor. It was also a sad time to be a WCW fan. The arenas mostly looked small, dark and depressing. This was a company which was clearly struggling. There were still some big names on the roster who we'll be getting into in just a moment. But first, sit back and enjoy WCW 2001, was it actually good? Starting off looking at the divisions and the roster. The Cruiserweight scene is really where WCW shines and could have made a huge comeback. By 2001, the booking of this division had improved and the comedy routine with the belt was finished. The division was basically the same as the WWE Ruthless Aggression division, and that seems to be a loved time. Rey Mysterio, Chavo Guerrero, Jeff Hardy's stoner friend, Shane Helms, Billy Kidman amongst others, it really did seem like a hell of a division. Plus then you've got the younger guys that were on the verge of something as WCW went under, and then they went to TNA and formed the X division. Which leads me on nicely to talk about something new that WCW did in 2001. The Cruiserweight tag titles. Now I happen to think this was actually pretty sensible from WCW. They had a large amount of cruiserweights, so why not have a second belt for them to compete for? And just think what AJ Styles went on to accomplish when he became the entire face of the company. He was on the rise, and if WCW had survived, I have no doubt that this man would have been a company legend. This Cruiserweight tag team division would also be a good place for the lower card guys who were still learning without too much pressure on them. And it's not like it was forced, there were established teams for this division such as the Young Dragons, Filthy Animals and Free Count. Shout out Jimmy Yang, who would have also been phenomenal in this company if it had stuck around. This would have been a brilliant comeback for the Cruiserweights after WCW had demolished the division into the ground a year prior. They spent much of the first few months of 2001 holding a tournament to crown the first tag team champions, and this meant that you were pretty much guaranteed a good high-flying match each week. The first champions were Kid Romeo and Elix Skipper, which seems quite random, but these are another two guys who could have incredible high-flying matches. I really do believe this would have been a great division, and coupled with the Cruiserweight singles division, the WWF would have been envious. These are the guys that most wrestlers look up to nowadays, and WCW deserved the credit for amassing such a large talented group. They actually managed to eventually replace the Luchadors and the Radicals who had made the division so great in the first place. Whilst the WCW Hardcore division was nothing to write home about, you still had the hardcore legend Terry Funk there. He had star power and he was the correct person to build the division around. But then you also had Crowbar, who was an incredibly underrated talent. He always tried to put on a spectacle. Throw in Meng, who was a good fit here, Norman Smiley and Bam Bam Bigelow, and you could really do something with this division. I'm not sure if you would actually want to bother, but the possibility was there with a decent group of established guys. Talking of hardcore, WCW made its final raids of the also struggling ECW around this time. In the year 2000 they snatched up Lance Storm and Mike Awesome, who were sensible additions that you could potentially push higher up the card. They did at least strengthen the mid-card. Obviously what happened with Mike here didn't work out, but he was still worthy of a place on the card. Then you've got Jason Jett, aka Easy Money. He might not be a household name, but I think he was pretty impressive whenever he turned up in WCW. They also got Kid Cash, who was shoved on the final episode of Thunder, and he's another one that I have no doubts would have made waves in WCW. He was just so much fun to watch around this time. You also have Johnny Swinger. I never personally enjoyed his work, but I know a lot of people do, and he is someone who could do sports entertainment wrestling. And not to keep bringing up TNA in this video, but it's kind of unavoidable. But WCW had a whole bunch of guys who hadn't even made the main roster yet, but guys who would go on to become parts of TNA. Guys like Chris Harris, James Storm, the Hot Shots and Sonny Siaki. With these guys about, the tag team division had a chance to improve, because it sure needed to improve. There was only two sets of tag team champions in 2001. They were the Insiders, Kevin Nash and DDP, and the Natural Brawn Thrillers, Palumbo and O'Hare. Nash and DDP didn't really defend the belts, but the Thrillers did. Also in the tag division you had the Mamalukes, Awesome and Storm, Totally Buff and Chronic. It seems like Chronic were perhaps going to be built up to be the guys to run the tag division in 2001, but we never quite got there. I always found it strange during the invasion that Chronic were pushed originally. It was like they had been a big deal in WCW, but really they hadn't accomplished anything. But yeah, unlike the WWF's tag team division at the time, it just doesn't feel very exciting, does it? Everyone feels a little bit samey. On the subject of the natural born thrillers, this group, Palumbo, O'Hare, Stasiak, Jindrak and Sanders, were mostly power plant graduates. They were a group that WCW pushed pretty hard. They would often go on to have multiple segments per show. I don't know about these guys, they were mostly a bit bland, although O'Hare did manage to show some intensity when he got the microphone. Whilst these guys were only going to get better, none of them went on to be main eventers. I'd like to think if WCW had stuck around, Sean O'Hare could have eventually made it to the main event scene. But heavyweights with huge potential seem to be pretty rare in 2001. And the main issue in 2001 was the main event scene. I don't think they even knew what to do with their main event scene. It was a complete mess. After years of just pushing the same old guys, hardly anyone had been built up to carry this company. They all got injured at once too, and what was left? You had Booker T, who grafted incredibly hard for his spot at the top of the card, but I still don't really see him as a 5-star main eventer. He wasn't quite there. Then you had Scotty Steiner, who had come on leaps and bounds with his character work, but his in-ring work had gotten a lot worse due to injuries. Most of his matches were screwy finishes. It was also just better watching Steiner in segments rather than matches. And of course you had Diamond Dallas Page, who was no spring chicken in 2001. Those were really the only 3 legit guys they had managed to build up. Slapnuts obviously doesn't count. He's not a proper main eventer. There was no Hogan. There was no Scott Hall. Kevin Nash was doing more booking work and lost a loser leaves WCW match in February 2001. Sting had been injured since November 2000 and only turned back up in WCW on the final Nitro. Goldberg went off TV in January 2001 for shoulder surgery. Bret Hart had retired due to injury towards the end of 2000. Sid Vicious broke his leg at the start of 2001. Ric Flair was barely wrestling at this time. It was just hopeless. No show could sustain losing that many top stars, and it was all the fault of WCW for not thinking about their future. That's why we ended up with the main event scene being the worst part of WCW in 2001. They desperately tried to shoehorn some guys in as main eventers, which really did more harm than good. Rick Steiner, Dustin Rhodes and the Road Warrior Animal. They weren't exactly young either, proving WCW had not really learnt from its own mistakes. One slight sign that they might have learned some lessons though was that some of the older talent did start to put over younger talent. Lex Luger in particular seemed quite willing to do the JOB. We haven't spoke about storylines much, which is strange in a WCW video, but to be honest, it wasn't a major few months in terms of storylines. Not a whole lot was happening, the show felt a bit flat, like they were treading water waiting for something to happen. The main storyline was that of the Magnificent Seven. I'm not sure what was so magnificent about them. It was the same old usual faces. Ric Flair was the leader. Both Steiners were in the group. Jarrett, Bagwell, Luger. Yeah, it was just another NWO knockoff. But this time they got Road Warrior Animal. Yay, I'm sure that made all the difference. Forming in January 2001, this faction didn't have much time to accomplish anything. They mostly just feuded with DDP, Kevin Nash and the Rhodes family. Oh yeah, and the Cat. They were battling him for control of the company. It wasn't the most exciting cast of characters at this point. It ended, I'm not sure where this was supposed to be heading, but it was clear that WCW had either run out of ideas or was just waiting for a reboot. I mean seriously, why another NWO type faction? We'd seen this for years at this point. If WCW had survived and they'd done their planned reboot and ran a pay-per-view called The Big Bang, some additions were likely to happen. And they sure needed it if WCW was to survive. So there were some guys and girls who were lining up to join WCW. Chyna was desperate to leave WWF and get away from Triple H and Stephanie. Road Dogg was literally backstage at the final Nitro looking for work. D'Lo Brown simply had a horrible year 2000 and he missed his buddy Russo. Jerry Lawler and his wife the Cat were rumoured for the next pay-per-view. Former ECW champion Steve Corino, former ECW TV champion The Whole Effing Show Rob Van Dam, Joey Styles and Don Callis. It was also rumoured that they had a good look at Brock Lesnar before WWE made him a huge offer for a guy with no in-ring career. If WCW managed to get RVD and Brock Lesnar, they would have been very welcome in the main event scene, although I'm not sure any of the previously mentioned guys would have really done much to save the company. In terms of pay-per-views, we got 3 in the year 2001, which were Sin, Super Raw Revenge and Greed. Whilst the first two shows are nothing special, they are still slightly better than many of the pay-per-views from the year 2000, and the final pay-per-view, Greed, was one of the best in a long time. So this did give you some modicum of hope for the future. These shows were mostly improved by the work rate of the Cruiserweight undercard, but it also helped that lots of the silly stuff which had made it onto the show in the year 2000 had been left in the past. I have to say though, I think having a great undercard just wasn't enough. People tune in to see the stars, and there just weren't enough in WCW anymore. Yeah, Sting, Flair and Nash might have returned somewhere down the line, but how long before they were injured again? I don't think Flair's heart was in it either. If WCW could have somehow survived, it would have taken TNA's spot. Low ratings and just getting by, and perhaps one day it could have risen back up. But there were some serious rebuilding needed here, no matter how great the undercard was. Whilst I don't really think WCW in 2001 was actually good, it was a bit more sensible, less chaotic, less wacky, and the in-ring stuff had been improved about 20%. But it still just had the feeling of a dying show, and nobody wants to watch one of those. It would have taken some big names to turn it around. And if you don't agree with that, I'll pound you into the ground.